Environmental Health Nursing's Legacy, including education, coaching, health policy. In thinking about presenting this to this conference, I thought about how medical-centric this conference has been. I don't know if, although we as nurses are now part of it, and the importance of what is our role, what is our legacy, what is our mission in healthcare, and very specifically the environment. It said that up to 90% of all conditions, symptoms, and chronic disease we see today has at least a contributing cofactor of an environmental component. And we could think of children in inner cities, women who are infertile in these times. The breast cancer increases globally. Cardiovascular disease, Mark Hyman alluded to diabesity and obesogens and chemicals that get stored in body fat, that it's much more than diet, it's much more than calories. And to look at how do we as nurses, working in so many different settings, both locally, nationally, and globally, how do we begin to assess and address the environmental components that might be contributing to symptoms? I just want to ask, how many of you here think about the environment when you're working with a patient or client in your work setting? Great. Okay. And since we're a small group, give me some of the areas that you work in where you might be curious about the environmental component in your patient's health. Oncology. Okay. As an independent patient advocate. Okay. So as a nurse, you have the opportunity when you're doing a history in radiology with newly diagnosed cancer patients of being able to ask questions that might give more information about what their exposures might have been and how that might have at least interfaced with other predisposition or genetic factors. Does that work for everybody? Okay. The ADHD problem in kids in school. And what I'd like to do is get through I have a long PowerPoint. I was up early editing it. I do want to look at neurotoxicity and immune components of environmental stressors or environmental exposures. But I want to start with making the link of our nursing legacy and Florence Nightingale. Okay. And this is from a book on the voice of Florence Nightingale in advocacy of the goal of nursing has remained unchanged, namely to provide a safe and caring environment that promotes patient health and well-being. We're being serenaded. Okay. So this is who we are. And this is, I believe, from a paraphrase of Florence Nightingale's work. And also, here's that quote from Notes on Nursing of the incidence of diseases related to the want of fresh air, or of light, or of warmth, or of quiet, or of cleanliness. And there's many references to Florence Nightingale and the role of the environment. Remember, she lived in a time before we had all the distractions of technology and pharmaceuticals and really worked with the elements that were available. And full circle coming back, this is where we are today. And then this is really about observation, because a big part of what we do as nurses, besides asking the questions, is also observing people in their homes, in their workplace, and for ourselves, how we do that as well when we have symptoms. And I have a case study of a nurse as we move forward in her environment at work and what she began to observe in trying to figure out and match the symptoms to what might be happening in the workplace. So basically, this is just a very quick review of what has been presented so far in the conference, that we live in a world where, due to our food supply, we're nutritionally depleted and we're environmentally challenged. We're on environmental overload. A big part is from our food supply, so you really can't separate our food and our environment and the chemicals in our food chain. So the question really becomes for each of us, and when I say each of us, it's as nurses in our own self-care, as well as the people that we work with in our communities, our patients, of how do we begin to work with people to empower them, encourage them, support them, educate, advocate for creating a healthier lifestyle. And we know that these are all the influences on health. We start with the genetic, the biochemical, cultural, physical, mental, emotional, social, psychological, spiritual, economical, and environmental. And this is our holistic nursing framework, not within any particular organization. When I say holistic nursing, it's who we are and what's embedded in our culture as nurses. And some of the areas that also we have to think about in a systems way of thinking of environmental influences on health are the social and the economical. And we hear about whether it be where Superfund sites are, where, dumping grounds that are usually on the other side of the tracks in poorer communities, access to good food that Mark Hyman was talking about that doesn't allow us the nutrients to detoxify the chemicals that we take in, and also the cultural component of people, for example, Native Americans, who switch very quickly to an unhealthy environment and food. What happens in terms of the way that their genetic and epigenetic expression creates different health patterns and illness. And of course, our physical and work and community and home environment. This is a really big piece of what are we exposed to on a daily basis, even at low levels, that over time, the studies may show, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, although maybe I am, studies are always done in very minute amounts to show that they really don't cause harm. But what happens when those small amounts are repeated over and over again on a daily basis, whether it's our perfumes that we're breathing in, or secondhand cigarette smoke, or the pesticides that we put in our gardens, or that our dogs roll in and then come and sit on our bed. And also how the environment influences our mind, body, emotions, and our psychology. I mean, we know that there are toxins that lodge and have a propensity and affinity to brain tissue. Mercury is the perfect example. The Mad Hatter, you all know that story. The Mad Hatter worked with the pins that they'd put in their mouth to make the hats, and there was mercury in the making of the hats, and thus the Mad Hatter. Little point of trivia. You never heard that? Google it. Okay, and then of course the biological and the biochemical. And we've already heard a little bit at this conference about epigenetic expression. We all have our genetic makeup, but what are the triggers and the antecedents and the mediators that push us toward that overload? Yesterday, I think it was Jeff Bland who spoke about the BRCA gene and the fact that there is this increase in the expression of the BRCA gene, whereas in the 1920s and 30s, your grandmothers and great-grandmothers may have had the same gene, but they never got breast cancer. So what has changed? The gene is expressing itself. And there was recently, in the last year or two, the University of Miami went down to the Bahamas because there was an epidemic of breast cancer. And all these young women were getting breast cancer. And they sent a team from UM, and of course they recommended prophylactic surgery, hysterectomy, and probably radiation as a prevention. And I asked the question, or I thought to myself, did anybody ask about their mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers? Because if there's this younger generation, what's going on in the community that might be fueling this? And nobody asked those questions, to my knowledge. I wish that someone could fund a project like that. Is there new industry in the community Are the fish contaminated that they're eating every day? Did pesticides suddenly come into their community in fast food? And is it accumulative? So maybe there is a BRCA gene in that particular population and culture. And what else was going on in the environment that allowed it to express itself? So these are the kind of questions. I was working with a young woman who, and this is, of course, I haven't gotten to the second slide yet, but she came to see me for some coaching and nutrition. For those that don't know me, hi, I'm Susan Luck. And I also happen to be, other than a holistic nurse educator, a clinical nutritionist and an integrative nurse coach and a medical anthropologist. So I'm really interested in looking at cultural variations and what is going on with a changing environment. But this young woman came to see me. She was in her 20s, and she had recently had a child, so there was a lot of hormonal changes. And she had been diagnosed with estrogen-positive breast cancer and was in the process of having a double mastectomy and radiation prophylactically. I don't think she had any involvement with her lymph nodes. And so she came to just find out what she could do, and of course she was in a very stressed state, having a newborn. And I started to take a history. And I asked her questions, and then I asked her more questions, and I said, tell me about your work history. And she started to tell me about, well, my parents own, in South Miami, a dry cleaning business, and I worked there all through high school. And I said, do you think there might be any relationship between that? She said, I don't know. She said, I've been to 3 oncologists and 5, endocrinologists, and no one ever asked me that question. And I thought, why was that important? It was important to understand that she may have been exposed to all of the plastics and the chemical compounds and the persistent organic pollutants and everything that's in the dry cleaning itself and in the air and the plastic bags and everything she was touching, but also to prevent her from further going back there as she was breastfeeding, for example, because she wasn't working, and for her to have a sense of that and to have more of an understanding of how she was vulnerable. So this is about looking at vulnerability and seeing where one can impact. So this is on a health and wellness continuum. There is everything that we talk about that's part of health and wellness: mind, body, spirit, culture, environment. But I want to just address environmental exposures and a healthy environment today. Okay. So I want to look at around the world what's going on. The World Health Organization came out with a study recently that said the global health crisis is now not the epidemics of disease that we knew, but non-communicable diseases. It's no longer viral and bacteria, but it's obesity, endemic, epidemic, heart disease, and cancer. And again, so the question is, nurses are everywhere. We're in communities, we're in healthcare settings, we're in home care. So what is our potential to lead in prevention? And we always say, there's 33,500,000 nurses in the United States. There's 17 million globally. Imagine for a moment if nurses had an the information as well as the ability to really work in communities, in all communities and homes, in advocacy. And I will say again, Florence Nightingale was an advocate for the environment. So I started looking at the research and looking again at our legacy today and looking at what the ANA position paper was in 2007, looking at they put forth a call to action encouraging nurses to gain a working understanding of the relationships between human health and environmental exposures and to integrate this knowledge into practice. This is integrative nursing. It's another dimension of what we talked about yesterday on the panel. And then The ICN, the International Council of Nurses, which is a global organization, looked at lifestyle-related health risks, and this came out in 2012. And in their position statement, concerned about the enormous human suffering caused by the growing burden of environmental and lifestyle-related non-communicable diseases, which are largely preventable. And they asked that nurses and all national nursing associations play a strategic role in helping reduce environmental and lifestyle health risks. How many of you here are a member of a nursing organization, a specialty organization? Okay. Does your specialty organization have a position on the role of nursing in environmental health and education? Okay, anyone? The AHNA. AHNA and RN Patient Advocate. What about the more mainstream traditional?
I don't think the oncology nurses.
Okay. You don't think the oncology nurses? What?
They should.
Person up here, Kathy, says they should. Yes, they should. And we have an oncology nurse here who, when she does an intake in radiology, asks environmental questions. But is that because you have an interest in knowing, or more than a policy? So this is where, in health policy and in advocacy, how could we begin to change our organizations? You know, 30,000 people write to Johnson & Johnson and they say, take the chemicals out of, you know, baby shampoo that are harmful. And Johnson & Johnson takes them out. How do our nursing organizations listen to our nurses, and how do you begin campaigns? Yesterday, briefly in the panel, Barbara Glickstein and others spoke to how do we have a voice? How do we begin to write for journals? There was an article that startled me yesterday when I opened up the internet and the news feed came up. And it said, doctors stunned by 24 newborns born without, only born with partial brains and partial skulls in northern Washington state. Between January 13th and going back, I think, maybe several months. And the questions the doctors asked, even the CDC, were preposterous. They said, did you smoke? Did you drink alcohol, and do you have any diseases? And they didn't get any epidemiological correlation, so they said, we're stunned. We don't know what it is. And the CDC is investigating. But of course, if I were a nurse, or any of you in that community, what would you do if you were working in neonatal or, you know, labor and delivery or, you know, pediatrics, and you started to see children coming in with similar patterns? As nurses, what is our voice, and how would we begin to ask those questions rather than just see another person with a similar situation? Because the environmental exposures are just escalating at amazing rates. So I want to touch on something. I don't have the quote with me, but Florence Nightingale once talked about, if the copper kettle is turning black, get rid of it. In other words, she identified copper toxicity in the water that was being boiled. That's the precautionary principle, to do no harm. So this is a working definition: when human activities may lead to morally unacceptable harm that is scientifically plausible but uncertain, action shall be taken to avoid or diminish that harm. Morally unacceptable harm refers to harm to humans or the environment that is threatening to human life or health, serious and effectively irreversible, inequitable to present or future generations, or imposed without adequate consideration of human rights of those affected. And I would say that most of the chemicals that we look at today in the environment are not following the precautionary principle, because it's the responsibility of corporate to make sure we're safe. Yet why are we here, and what do we need to do? We need to educate ourselves and our communities, because we're not getting the right information. It's either not being researched, or it's being researched and the information is not getting to us. So there is a certain amount of trying to look at what is going on in our environment. Discovering toxic body burden. What are the patterns of toxicity that you see in your clinical practice? And what do those patterns look like? And how do you do an environmental assessment? And I'm hoping we're going to take a little time at the end. I have an environmental assessment tool that I will give you, and if we have time, we can fill it out and talk about it. But this is really important to start to think. You know, we think about what do you eat, you know, whether it be because of obesity or anorexia or malnutrition or cachexia from chemotherapy. And then we have to also think about what environmental patterns are we looking at. So I think there's a lot to be learned when we look at indigenous peoples here in this country and around the world. And this was a recent paper that came out October 2013, which was on climate change and indigenous peoples in the U.S., the impact, the experiences, and actions. And this is a voice of a culture, of many cultures, but coming together to say, look what's happening to our environment. And whether we're talking about climate change, or we're talking about GMO foods, or the amount of pesticides on our crops and fertilizers from some of the big agribusiness, there is a real concern. And I think that we need to look to our other experts, if you will, on what is happening and what do we need to do. A paper came out on International Nurses Day a couple of years, 2007, also looking at how do we have positive, healthy environments, creating healing environments and quality health in the workplace. And I'm going to look at some of the studies that were done. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, they're part of NIH, came out with a big position paper looking forward at 2012 to 2017, looking at the big influences that have been understudied and all which interact with traditional environmental exposures, the microbiome, for example. And I think that's really interesting that, the NIH group is looking at the microbiome, and Mark Hyman mentioned it. How do chemicals, whether it be GMOs getting implanted into our gut bacteria or other ways that all these chemicals are bathing our digestive system and causing things like inflammatory bowel disease, and looking at all inflammatory pathways, immunological pathways, and epigenetic processes. And I just had a research article that I shared last night with one of the other speakers, which was looking at the whole area of gluten sensitivity. And I know they're talking about it right now, probably in the other room with David Perlmutter, who wrote the book Rain Brain. But here's something really interesting. A study came out last week that said, is it the gluten or is it the glyphosate that are from Roundup, which are a fertilizer or a pesticide, rather, that is sprayed on the wheat crops, that is causing the tight junctions in the bowel to open and allowing things like the proteins, the gluten in wheat, to come through before they're digested. And is the inflammation just the gluten? When we say people don't have celiac disease, but there's so much gluten sensitivity. Well, is it the gluten or is it the environment, our interior environment, that's not allowing the gluten to be properly digested, and so it penetrates and permeates too quickly, traveling through our bodies, and all these immune alarm systems go off and all the inflammatory cytokines. So even when we think about allergies and sensitivities, think what else might be tagged onto that. You know, when people do food allergy testing, I always wonder, is it the food or is it all the chemicals that are attached to the food supply? Just a thought. And then looking at environmental challenges for public health and safety, and I brought this up earlier, long-term exposures that we commonly encounter harming our health, small doses synergistically over time. And again, precautionary principle, what level of proof do we need of harm before some action is taken? And again, we are a powerful body of professionals. We're trusted, we have a voice, and how can we help to raise that level of proof that's needed? And what are the measures? So I'm going to go back to workplace, but we think of doing an environmental assessment everywhere, from the labels and foods we eat, the cleaning products and personal care products, all of our lifestyle factors, including pharmaceuticals, and looking at our home, workplace, and community. And we know these are the exposure pathways from, our soil, our air, our sediment. I'm not going to go through all of that. But a recent report, February 2014, like yesterday, came out from the International Agency for Research on Cancer and the World Health Organization, with 250 leading scientists from 40 countries. And they are saying that the global battle of cancer will not be won with treatment alone. Right? Effective prevention measures are urgently needed. So,
10 years ago.
or 50. But what does this mean? How do we interface our knowledge as health professionals and this helplessness of seeing younger and younger people? I could say that it used to be my parents' generation that was getting cancer. Now it's my friends, and I'm talking 10 years ago. So what is happening that's accelerating that epigenetic expression? And this was just that the World Health Organization said that cancer will increase 50% by the year 2020, and that's not far away, unless preventative measures are put in place. So again, I ask, as nurses, where do we fit in this change in prevention and health promotion? We know there are cancer clusters all over the country. I think some of you, how many of you live in cancer cluster communities? Okay. Okay, so there's a lot of hands up. Long Island, Cape Cod, Marin County, California, and many others are cropping up. And, is it in the water, the shallow water table? Is it that you live close to nuclear power plants? Is it the runoff from agriculture and pesticides? Is it just a lifestyle change that's happening, and a little of all of the above? But this is really the other part of this. When I mentioned the children in northern Washington, another part is the birth defects that we're seeing more and more, and the burden that is. Breast cancer is rising in China. I mean, this was a study looking at that, and it's 10 years earlier in China than in this country. The industrialization of China so quickly, including changes in their traditional diets and lifestyle, along with, quote unquote, their genetics, because their family history had no significant connection to the disease. So what does that mean in terms of what is happening in their genome? Harvard came out with a study that said we need an international cancer prevention policy looking at eliminating environmental exposures implicated. So this is 2011. We have the information. We all know this about China. I mean, 8-year-old with lung cancer, living in an environment where there is no air. And we know all that, lead and pesticides and heavy metals, mercury, arsenic, people that live near coal mines where mercury is really intense in the air from the mining. I live in Miami, where every day they're finding new toxic playgrounds where the children are playing, because now there's a move from a lot of activists in the community of testing the soil. And all the soil has been brought in from other places and probably from Superfund sites. And so the soil is really high in heavy metals, mercury, and arsenic. And parents are speaking up because this is their children and the next generation. And it's been really hard because developers and people that own land, they don't want to change what's going on. This was the Cape Cod, which has in cancer cluster, looking at the drinking water, and they looked at pharmaceuticals, consumer products, and chemicals that were in wells and septic systems. And that's very concerning for people with well water, thinking it's clean, fresh water. And the financial costs, the burden to our culture. So when we think about it, and I'm going to get through the doom and gloom because there's really hopefulness in this conversation for change and for advocacy, but this is what we're looking at in our food supply today. When we talk about organic food, there really is a reason. If we can, because there's a real challenge of asking to eat fresh fruits and vegetables and then looking at the amount of pesticides on most crops. And how do we do that? We also know that in animal products, besides everything else we know now about meat, unless it's farm grazed outside, the amount of testosterone and hormones that are in our food supply. And yesterday, again, when Jeff Bland spoke about hormones, we think about not just estrogen hormone replacement therapy and xenoestrogens, but which are the chemicals in the environment that mimic estrogens and go to estrogen receptor sites in the breast, ovaries, prostate. We're also looking at injecting hormones into foods and then eating them, and then also hormones that are the byproduct in excretion and wind up in our water supply. Everybody's eating salmon today. But what about farm-raised salmon? What do we know about it? I mean, the EPA says that you should only eat one meal of farmed salmon a month. And that includes Scottish salmon. I mean, it's still farm-raised. When you could get that wild Alaskan salmon when it's running, that's the time to get it. And the truth is, you can even get it at Costco, frozen. So you can get wild salmon. It's not easy. But, the fish are, we say on one hand, fish oil can really help the immune system, and then we have the challenge of the kind and quality of the fish. And some of you may know this. I don't know if it's been shown here yet. But, our genes haven't changed. But our environment has. And we already talked about this synergy. I want to talk a few minutes about prenatal exposures, because when we look at a history and we ask somebody about their life, like the woman who I mentioned, think about this. Where was her mother working? She was only 23. What did she come into this life with because of the exposure of her mother, who was already working in the dry cleaning business? So again, we get not just our chromosomes, but we get all of the exposures that also come with that. So this was a study done on Mexican-American children whose parents worked in fields in Mexico and were exposed to pesticides, and they had developmental problems and poor mental health. So here's an interesting study on organic food. Children who've been exposed to pesticides, when they were given a diet that was organic without pesticides, a dramatic, immediate protective effect happened against those very pesticides, and their system was cleared within a very short period of time. So the good news is, by changing our lifestyle, our diet, and our behaviors, we really can impact our health. Okay, many of you already know this study that was done on newborns, and it was a benchmark study with the Environmental Working Group and the American Red Cross, showing more than 275 chemicals in umbilical cord blood during what's called critical windows of development. And the main areas we think of are the immune system, the nervous system, the endocrine system, and the cardiovascular system. And I think Walter Crinian, is actually presenting on the environment and cardiovascular health. We heard already about endocrine system, the nervous system. How do pesticides work? They destroy, paralyze, impact the nervous system of the critters they're trying to kill. So if we're taking in those pesticides, how does that affect our nervous system, whether it be over a lifetime, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, memory dysfunction, to really think about that, the impact on our total health. This is another integrative model. We're not like in medicine, one system, one specialty, and another. We're integrative. When something is affected, everything is affected. And it's much more of a functional medicine paradigm, which I like to call functional health. Okay. So throughout the life cycle, and I highlighted the areas where we are most impacted. Certainly in this phase of where the mom is at prior to conception and through her pregnancy, and the father that works with lead-based paint or works with ceramics that have lead in Mexico, that too will be communicated through the sperm and into the newborn. Infancy and childhood, there are these windows of development, and even exposures prenatally and will manifest in certain times in that rapid spurt of growth and development. And certainly puberty and adolescence, because that's what we're hearing about hormones that we're exposed to early in life and prenatally. So the timing, the dose, and the combination of exposures. And this is a report that's really significant for those of you that want to research Sandra Steingraber. She wrote a really important paper on the falling age of puberty, looking at the increase in endocrine disruptors and hormones and how that is creating little girls to have breast buds and pubic hair as early as 8 years of age and menstruate, and that this is due, again, to the environmental exposures. And some of the other, what happens to young children who mature prematurely and the emotional burden that they carry with that. And it really leads to other health risk patterns. And that was breast cancer. There's a website, breastcancerfund.org. They've come out with incredible policy statements and research papers. One is the state of breast cancer, and they do a new one every year. And they look at all the research, looking at the environmental impact. And they're very big on enough of pink ribbons. Let's really talk about the real issues that are involved. And she wrote a book called Living Downstream. Sandra's a woman who had breast cancer and was, she looked at the well water, and she has the Silent Spring Institute in Cape Cod that does a lot of work with looking at the source of why so many young women have breast cancer. So I put this in because I think this is the easiest way to remember endocrine disruptors. They all start with P's. Pesticides, pollutants, persistent pollutants, petrochemicals, plasticizers like bisphenol A, and phthalates, pigments, dyes, colorings. Somehow the P got lost in perfume. Preservatives, flame retardants, and pharmaceuticals. So I talked earlier about the precautionary principle. I thought this was interesting that the Endocrine Society, for those that don't know, is a very conservative medical society that promotes hormone replacement therapy and was really against the study that came out. And yet they came out in 2009 with a scientific report that said that endocrine disrupting chemicals, there's strong evidence towards serious health problems, and recommended people take a precautionary approach. So again, a little bit more atrazine. Atrazine is the fungicide that is sprayed mainly on corn, sugar, wheat, and is the one that Tyrone Hayes, how many of you know about Tyrone Hayes, the amphibian biologist at Berkeley, was working for the company that made atrazine, the most widely used herbicide, fungicide in the world. And he was asked to research its safety, and when he started seeing the male frogs have sacs that had female eggs and were turning sexually, he tried to bring it out to the public, and he was silenced and threatened, and his funding was taken away by his lab, by the company Syngenta, and he's been on a campaign to get the word out. He also has 2 young daughters. And this is where it becomes very challenging when you're dealing with industry. But the good news is that we all work on local levels in our communities. And in our communities, we could find out the pesticides that are being used, the source of where that's going in our water supply, and how we could impact the community. So we've talked, I wanted to just, bisphenol A was mentioned by Jeff Bland, but I wanted to just go through a little bit of the literature. I'm not going through the chemical pathway that makes it look like estrogen, and so it's taken up by estrogen receptor cells. But the literature that shows the associations between bisphenol A exposure and adverse perinatal childhood and adult health outcomes, including reproductive and developmental effects, metabolic disease, and other effects. And this was from a journal on reproductive toxicology in 2013. The reference is at the bottom. This is some of the health effects that we're looking at as an endocrine disruptor. Involved probably in heart disease, diabetes. It's stored in fat tissue. It contributes to obesity, liver inflammation, and it's linked to all hormonal cancers, including thyroid cancer. And there's also a tremendous increase in thyroid diseases, which we can also look at other chemicals that are affecting our thyroid. Infertility, impotence. And there's a couple of articles I just wanted to share. We say, I ate a healthy diet, I exercised, I did everything right. Well, we've got to go back, because the question is, does breast cancer begin in the womb? And that was the title of the Clinical Pharmacological Toxicology Journal in 2008 that looked at several generations of mice, and now it's been done in human studies, who were exposed to bisphenol A and then looked 7 generations out, and were able to still see mammary changes prenatally in the breast, in the way that breast buds are formed, and the amount of them, which leads to in puberty having more activity. And another journal, Endocrinology, in 2005, by Muniz de Toro, and some other things that. This is kind of out of sequence, but this is about pesticides. We just talked about it. But also pesticides are endocrine disruptors, and also their research has shown increasing the risk of breast and testicular and prostate cancer. So what is bisphenol A? I think we all know it's the plastics, the soft, the malleable plastics, whether it be in nail polish or in the containers that we use. And what can we again do with the people we're working with when we do an environmental assessment, asking even about, do you use a microwave, which they shouldn't stand in front of? How do you heat your foods? Ask the questions. You don't want people microwaving in the plastic because the polymers leach out into the food. Breast Cancer Fund came out with a report in September 13 on BPA, looking at it. It's in all supermarket shelves. It's the lining in canned food. Bisphenol A was discovered at the turn of the century. It was originally used when electricity became available, and it was a sealant to help electrical conduction as a polymer that would protect the electrical wiring. That's its original intention. But now it's in everything. And you can find it in many, many products. Here's some examples. I just suggest you go to safecosmetic.org, you put in your favorite personal care products, and you can find out what's in them. Because it's in the lining of foods, here's just something that you can share with your patients. The woman who just got diagnosed with breast cancer, you're hoping for long-term survivorship. She's gone through the treatment, or he. We know that more men are getting breast cancer. But then going back to the same patterns of microwaving in plastic, using cans. I mean, these are little things, but again, it's that small dose over time. And this was a recent study, came out in the last month or so, that looked at 20 minutes after exposure to levels of bisphenol A measured in blood and in animals. They were able to see how high it circulated in the system. And this was a packaging study on looking at reducing the risk. This was done by the Breast Cancer Fund and the Silent Spring Institute in 5 families. And for 3 days, they took them off of all of their foods, which was basically packaged and canned foods. And they put them on fresh food, no canned, packaged, or in plastic containers. And they avoided all of it. And what happened was, by just 3 days, their bisphenol levels dropped in their blood 60%. So when we say, stop using, if you're eating a lot of canned foods, which a lot of people do, if they belong to food banks, if they get food stamps, if they live in inner city communities where they don't have access to fresh food, it's very common. But how do we, again, in communities, empower them to find healthier choices?
Just a question about the EPA in plastics. And a lot of things that you can get without it. So, are those storage containers that are BPA-free safe or not?
Well, we don't know that because BPA is because there's so much publicity now, they're replacing it with something else, and we don't really know. I would say it's worth it. At Kmart, you can get, a package of 16 little glass Pyrex with the plastic top, which you can also put in the microwave if people choose to do that, or store it in a container. But I think the more we can, if I bring something to the cleaners, I ask them to take the plastic off and, air out your clothes before you put them in plastic next to the other clothes in a closet that has no ventilation. And then you touch the plastic and it's bleached into your clothing, especially, in places like in warm climates. So there's very simple lifestyle changes that we can make. Transitioning a little, I also want to talk about kids, and Dorothy, you brought this up, about children and ADHD. There's been a lot of studies looking at artificial colorings that children love, and it's been marketed to the tune of billions of dollars for them to eat their foods, and these are some of the dyes in them. And the research shows that they cause hyperactivity, they cause developmental and learning disabilities, and food coloring, and I've said this, some of you may have heard this in a lecture before, but food coloring originally came into being because there was pre-refrigeration. That food had to be colored because it turned color so quickly and oxidized, maybe even rotted. So food coloring was instituted in the 30s. And it was never reviewed until the 70s or 80s as to what are these chemical dyes. And they're still being used. And some of the disabilities we see with food colorings, along with the pesticides, are the neurodevelopmental disabilities. And systematic review identified 5 industrial chemicals that were the most heavily attributed in research to developmental neurotoxicants, and those are mainly heavy metals. We know about lead. I mean, lead was banned in 1978, but people that live in older homes, the paint peels off and the lead is still exposed, and certainly on the face of buildings. And this was from the Lancet Neurology, March 2014. It hasn't even happened yet. This was, ahead in European journals. And I pulled this off. Dorothy. Did everyone hear that in the back? I'll repeat it for the question. The question is, person who eats a specific food with a coloring in it and also has Asperger's or some neurodevelopmental problem, how much of that in the pattern of repetition of eating the same foods and also having an affinity to certain colors. Textures, colors. If you've worked with autistic children, they're very, very specific in their their likes and preferences? It's a really good question. As a child, it's very challenging. But, I could say that parents of autistic children, they do take foods away. And the child, just like all children, they get distracted and they readjust. Or maybe there's now Jell-O with real red beet coloring, different than sugar. And the other thing about Jell-O, interestingly, is it's all sugar. I mean, you know what it is when you pull it out and you get that fume. We all probably had it as kids. How does the sugar interface with the chemicals as a whole other, mix? How do you test for BPA? You can test for bisphenol A with a couple of labs. There are some labs here that do, I don't know if they're here, but Metametrics is one that does toxicity testing, including heavy metals. And there's a couple of other labs. I mean, I'd say, you can ask here at the show or you can go online, but you can test blood, you can test urine. You may even be able to test saliva. I don't know. There are different labs who do it. Right. Genova and Metametrics merged. Are they here? Genova or Metametrics. I would just go on their website because you can get a lot of information from them. I think, testing is one thing, but testing, especially when it's not your traditional LabCorp or Quest, becomes very expensive out of pocket. I mean, you can test for mercury, you can test for heavy metals, but those are what's circulating in the blood. It's not really telling you what's in the tissue of your brain. You have to do a chelation test, you have to, collect urine, and that's a whole other functional medicine piece. So nurses who are working in community might want to find out who your functional medicine docs are and see if you could work with them. If you're a nurse practitioner, you could probably do that kind of testing. But usually, from a community health perspective, the idea is to how do you, rather than know the number, draw a conclusion that if people have a lot of this in their system, it can't be good for them over time, along with not having the foods that help to the detoxification pathways to rid themselves of what they're taking in. Yeah, Mary.
Eden Organics.
So company Eden Organics took BPA out of the lining of the cans, and they're also much more expensive. And we have to think about, from a public health perspective, why is there lining in cans? I mean, it's to protect us from botulism and, rust and oxidation. I mean, there's a reason for the protection. It's that what is a safer way to do the same thing? No, they've replaced it with something else. The question was shelf life, and I don't know what they replaced it with. They may be a company with more integrity than some other companies who, I think, Heinz has taken BPA out of cans in Europe because Europe has banned BPA from food, but they didn't take it out in the U.S. because the FDA is still saying, and I think I might have some slides on that, the FDA, the jury is still out after all the research. So, I'm sorry? They banned GMOs in Europe. 11 states here have banned bisphenol A in sippy cups. That's as far as we've gotten. 11 states, and there's a senator in Massachusetts who has a bill up to ban BPA in all infant bottles and everything else. And there's some hospitals in the healthier hospital movement who have at least gotten bisphenol A and plastic tubing in neonatal units to be changed out. Nurses and IVs.
So only for infants.
Yeah, only in neonatal. So nurses have done that. But think about it. Think every time you're getting an IV or giving an IV of that, with the whatever is in there that might be leaching it out. So the other piece about bisphenol A is the endocrine disrupting programming for obesity. and in adipose tissue. And this is another real issue because, if humans are exposed in early life, it alters their stem cell compartment, which is pre-programmed toward an adipogenic fate. This results in a higher steady state of a number of adipocytes and potentially a lifelong struggle to maintain a healthy weight. So here's where, again, from an integrative nursing perspective, is it just about the food you're eating and the exercise you're getting? How do we begin to think about and integrate what else is going on in your environment? And in the same way that an obese person that loses weight too rapidly, what happens when all those chemicals get stirred up in their system? So slow weight loss with healthy foods to promote detoxification is really important. Okay, so the FDA says in 2010 there's some concern about BPA, and I'm just focusing on BPA because there's so much research, but you can extrapolate this to so many other areas. And they supported the actions to remove BPA from baby bottles, feeding cups, and the lining of formula cans. But they don't provide any details or time frame for these voluntary actions. So now it's up to the companies. But I did put in a slide. So here's the action. Europe banned in 2011 BPA. France voted to ban BPA in all food containers by 2014 and from food packages and materials of infants and young children in 2013. The FDA ultimately decided not to ban BPA from food and beverages. So here's where currently 11 states have banned BPA, and California passed a Toxic-Free Infant Act from baby bottles and sippy cups. But so even China has banned BPA. I mean, it's kind of a oxymoron, but they have. And when you start to look at the Surgeon General's fact sheet, that 2/3 of adults and nearly 1/3 of children are overweight or obese, in this whole thing of talking about obesity, there's nothing talking about obesogens. So again, scientists, have said that endocrine disruptors are really a part of that. I'm not going to go through this. I'd like to move on a little bit. If someone would give me a time check. Okay, we have to wind up. We have to wind up? Oh, I have till 12:30. Oh. Okay. So I want to talk about occupational health because how many of you work in hospitals? Okay. Communities. Independently. Okay, a good cross-section of everybody. Okay. So hospitals employ 1.6 million workers. Hospitals are also known to be one of the most contributing to pollution in our environment. Again, another irony. So how do we care for our health and the health of our communities when we're working in an environment that doesn't really support that? And there were several studies looking at the health risks of nurses. And I think, one of the things in holistic nursing and in self-care, we always talk about we start with ourself so that we could, whether it's, did we do a gluten-free diet so we can share with others what it's like and understand their struggle in trying to eliminate gluten? This is another area. How do we lower our risk and exposure when we're working with others? So the nurses' report showed that hazardous drugs, housekeeping chemicals, anesthetic gases, and disinfecting, sterilizing agents, when they were exposed to it, there was a higher incidence of birth defects and miscarriages. And interestingly, high exposure referred to an exposure frequently or at least once a week for 10 years. So the nurse that works in a hospital and is exposed slowly over time, even if it's once a week, might be having the effect of whatever their exposure is. And these were some of the other things that were mentioned in homes and hospitals. And in caring for patients in a typical workday, nurses handle dozens of chemicals, drugs, and agents to prevent, diagnose, control, or cure diseases. And, although these are all agents that might heal, the question really is, can they also do harm? These are the models. There are nurses out there that are doing incredible work in their communities. And one group that's really acknowledged nurses, and Harpreet, someone that I'd recommend that you also connect with, is through Healthcare Without Harm, the Nurse Luminary Group. And you can look that up. And nurse luminaries are nurses who tell a story about their work in doing something to change the environment in their communities, in the workplace that impacts others. And there are hundreds and hundreds of nurses who are doing this. But you see, how many of you know about the Luminary Project? Okay, very few. We should all know about that. And we should all be having a voice in that and be writing in our local newspaper or in the hospital newspaper, in the local nursing publication about what we are doing to really change, be part of the change in the environment. So a study that was done looking at 1,500 nurses by the environmental group in Healthcare Without Harm that I mentioned, in collaboration with the ANA, an Environmental Health Education Center at University of Maryland School of Nursing, looked at exposures to 11 common products in the hospital. And these were some of them. Triclosan. How many of you wash your hands several times a day in your workplace? Okay. Latex gloves, radiation, medications including chemotherapeutic agents, mercury cleaning products, and hospital food. Okay. And the study showed that the most frequently exposed were those: the sterilizing chemicals, the housekeeping cleaners, the residues from drug preparation, radiation, asthma, miscarriage, and certain cancers, and then the risk of birth defects. I work in a program at the University of Miami in clinical nutrition and functional medicine, and one of the docs, who is a hepatologist, stood up, because I did a presentation on the environment, and he said, I'm really having trouble. I don't know what to do. I'm working, and it's a public hospital, Jackson Hospital, in the unit where there's a really old radiation machine, X-ray machine. And he said, every time we use it afterwards, it rattles and it makes all this noise. And I don't know what to do about it. So I went to the nurses, and they said, yeah, we're experiencing the same thing. So he was just in a quandary. He said, I have young kids. And, if I'm exposed to that and I'm bringing it home, now I'm thinking. He had never really thought about the next step. So the group, we talk about the group and its nurses and nurse practitioners and physicians, they started to brainstorm, because a lot of them work in the same system. And they got together. And they went to human resources and to whoever the OSHA representative was, and they got rid of that machine. But it came from thinking about what the potential exposure was, and then organizing others in the healthcare environment so that together they could have more of a voice than one person. And that's a model for when Mark Kyman talked about community this morning. This is another way of thinking about community. How do you organize in your hospital system? Harpreet, did you work with several other practitioners, providers?
It was actually hospital. It wasn't mine doing it all.
It was hospital initiated.
It was
Okay.
hospital in the hospital.
That's great. And, greener hospital movement, there's a lot of hospital movements now. And I want to say they've all been started by nurses. And, there are now national conferences on greener hospitals, how to create healing environments, to, growing organic food on the roofs, to feed patients healthier food. There's a lot of interesting models now that are out there. And any one of us can initiate it and then find out who your kindred spirits are to do it together. So we've already gone through this. This was the actual, in the end, the study. I'm not sure where that pointer is here. And you could see in here This was the most exposure. Ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide, medications, and cancer drugs were the highest exposures. And I'm going to go through, bypass this, because I'm going to hand you all out to take with you an environmental questionnaire rather than do it here. I thought we could do it interactively. But for everyone to take and just to think about it and reflect on it and to share it. And it comes from part of a tool, a comprehensive assessment tool from the Integrative Nurse Coaching Program in the International Nurse Coach Association, because we integrate environmental health and environmental coaching into the program because we feel it is so important. So these were all questions. So I just want to do one case study of Jenny, a young nurse working on a med-surg unit. She was hoping to start a family, but she wasn't able to get pregnant. She had developed allergies and respiratory problems, and she noticed that her symptoms were more severe on the evening shift when the unit was cleaned with a strong-smelling disinfectant. She was also more fatigued than usual, and she started gaining weight, although her eating patterns hadn't changed. At work, she washed her hands approximately 50 times a day with a dry powder in the wall between patient rooms. So what do you start to think about? The strong smelling, you're saying maybe part of the respiratory. Whatever she's putting on her hands. I mean, we know our skin is our largest organ of both absorption and detoxification. So she may be taking things in internally. It's not just staying on the hands. Okay. The weight gain, I mentioned about obesogens. Maybe that some of these chemicals are at least contributing to that. And the fatigue that goes along with chemical exposures or respiratory problems where you're not getting all the oxygen that you might need. Okay, so she came to see me and really came because her friends had thought she was stressed out, and that's why she was having some, adult onset asthma, respiratory problems. But when we started doing the holistic intake history, we really focused on the environmental component, especially since it was a fairly new job and she was able to make, the question of, can you connect when you have those symptoms? Where are you? And start to explore that. Oops. So tell me about your workplace environment. Describe the cleaning products that you use, that are used. She needed to research it. I also asked about pesticides, which are probably in the hospital as well as in other locations. And what did she put on her hands? What was that? Get the information. Research it. Well, it was triclosan. Okay? Triclosan is what's used in hospitals, in those little things on the wall, and the FDA is now researching the safety of it. Urinary levels of triclosan are associated with allergens, food sensitization, which you mentioned, Kathy, about the microbiome and altering that, and elevated body mass index was associated with triclosan, so thus the weight gain. It is an endocrine disruptor. Okay, so what do? How do we advocate for safer cleaning products and hand washing in the workplace? Are there safer antimicrobial soaps? And the irony is, and you'll start seeing in the research, we don't even know if they're great antimicrobials. And is this part of building up the resistance that might be even fueling MRSA and some of the other things we're seeing in hospitals? We have to start thinking out of the box. And here's a couple of websites from the Mayo Clinic, from the FDA, all questioning the safety and efficacy of triclosan. So I want to take some questions, but I just want to leave you with a couple of pieces about advocacy. How many of you know there's an ongoing campaign right now with Revlon to get some of their endocrine disrupting chemicals out of their products? I mentioned that Johnson & Johnson got 30,000 signatures online, and they took the chemicals out of baby shampoo because they didn't want to lose the customers. So now there's a really vigorous campaign. If you go to the Breast Cancer Fund or Environmental Working Group, ewg.org, I have a list that you can look at the websites, to join the campaign, put it on your Facebook page, send it out. Social media is an incredible way to do advocacy and be part of this. So I put this up, Johnson & Johnson had a small ceremony this month to say, we've gotten these 30,000 signatures and we're listening. So they're using it as a marketing campaign tool for themselves. But we got at least one chemical out of the many. So here's some of the nursing, and I have their logos: Healthier Hospitals Initiative, Healthcare Without Harm, which is hcwh.org. There's a Green Guide for Healthcare, GGHC, and you could go to greenguideforhealthcare.org. I mean, hospital systems like Kaiser Permanente and others are getting on board with this. They save money, they keep their employees healthier, and it's starting to become popular to try to keep your environment safer and healthier. So for anybody here that works in a system, it's a wonderful opportunity to share this with your nurse managers, your administrators, and say, hey, this is going on all over the country, and there are conferences, there's resources. Even the way hospitals are being built, the built environment now, we're more light and more healing environments. The products that are being used inside, they may not all be LEED certified, but they're closer than they were. And so I want to also leave with saying the good news is, and a little bit was mentioned in Jeff Bland's talk and Mark Hyman's this morning, that we know the environmental determinants now of chronic disease, whether it be cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity. But we also recognize one is avoidance, which is what we're talking about, but there's also supportive therapies such as the nutrients that help to fuel the phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification pathways in the liver, that keep the gut healthy so that the chemicals don't get reabsorbed through the intestinal wall before they go through the system to be eliminated, and detoxification. And I think Mark's new book, Hyman's new book, is about that. But basically detoxification is how does what you take in be eliminated and neutralized on the way. And the other part of detoxification to me is detoxifying the external environment. So I would encourage everybody that, and this happens to be from the Children's Hospital in Canada, looking at the research of strategies including nutrition supplements to counter the toxic effects and to support metabolism, as well as exercise, sweating, and possibly medication to enhance excretion. Addressing environmental health and contributors to chronic disease has broad implications for society, with large potential benefits for improved health and productivity. So there's a hook for your institutions. Clean up the environment and you'll have healthier workers and better workers. But and clean up the external environment. Look for safer cleaning products. Find out what they are using. Where I live, in my building in Florida, who has no environmental consciousness, they buy pesticides, the county, that are the cheapest. And when you look on the package, you won't believe this, but it says, in the state of California, this product is banned because it's carcinogenic. In the state of California. But in Florida, they're buying it in bulk and using it in schools where the children are, where the windows are closed because of air conditioning, so no mold will grow. So how do parents and PTAs begin to ask the questions, what are you spraying, what are you using in our schools? And they are in that conversation, just like healthier foods in the schools. And so this is, again, phase 2 is the liver, where after foods start to get broken down through other pathways, they need all of the nutrients in whole foods and what, again, was talked about this morning, the crucifers, the cruciferous vegetables, those chemicals Jeff Bland mentioned yesterday, diindole methane and I3C and sulforaphane and glucosinolates. Those are all in nature. So the good news is, after everything we've just heard, we saw a couple of studies that get the chemicals out and the body clears it. If you can have the right foods to further impact the pathways for detoxification, you'll be able to have much better results. And in part, that's why detoxification and green juicing and everything is so popular today. And it's real, based on the research. So with that, what I'd like to do, I'll leave this up for the additional resources. The mic is open. I don't know what time it is, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, take a few questions. Myrta? Can you use the mic so we get it on?
Hi, my name is Myrta Rabinowitz, and I work for the North Shore LIJ Health System on Long Island. And it's not a question but a comment. I just wanted to share with you something that we did over at the Institute for Nursing, which is where I work. It's not a direct patient care area. It's more of a corporate setting. But I realized that just in looking around, that the environment was what I thought was a little toxic, because there were areas that were full of clutter and lots of old computers and equipment and things that weren't being used anymore. So we were able to, with the approval of our chief nurse executive, totally redesign our environment and get rid of all the clutter, paint, put up brand new pictures. And it was interesting that even within one of our conference rooms, there was an area that we didn't even know was there. There was a sink, an old faucet, just things that were part of our environment that we weren't even aware of. But in reorganizing and recreating this space, it not only made for a much happier environment when everyone comes in now and when people come to visit or for meetings, it really improved the collaboration amongst the staff and the ability to just feel more pleasant and healthier when you come to the work. So I think it's more than just the pesticides and all those types of things, but just what's in your environment when you come to work as well.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. It is an energetic shift when you're in an open, clear environment. And I think that's a beautiful model of how many of you work in cluttered environments and what happens when you begin to clear them out. How does that impact your work? Okay. So what is outgassing? Outgassing is, whether it be the flame retardant or the plastic seats in your new car that give off a certain, or shower curtains are the perfect example. Outgassing is the polymers and the chemicals that once they're open in the air, they start to get released from whatever they were packaged in. And that's why even the clothes and plastic in your closets, you can say the same. It doesn't always have an odor. But one of the things, that's said is put it outside and let it air out for a while before you ever use that in your home, whether it be shower curtains or a new car. Keep the windows open. So that you're not breathing that in, because even if you have leather seats, the dashboard and many parts of the car are plastic, and that's what it's giving off.
The carpets, I hear a lot of the polymers they use in carpets.
Well,
The
the carpets also have the flame retardants and some kind of sealant so that if you spill something, and so yes, carpets. We live in a world that we have a lot of this for technology and comfort. So open the windows, follow Florence Nightingale in, light and air as much as you can. Thank you. And I think that's a big piece in closing, that when we have exposures, they may be subtle, but they are impacting our immune system and in other ways that will have health results up the road if not addressed. So pay attention and be healthy. And I'm going to pass these out, or you can come up and get them. There are 2 pages. It's the environmental assessment, and the second page actually has a little bit about your priorities for change and how you might make the change, and to write a couple of steps in your home, your work environment after you read through this of what is your next step for you in changing the environment that might improve or impact your health. Thank you all. Sure.